Hello and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club. I'm your host this evening, and Tobias is doing the film. My name is Will Lagoma, and together we have a number of curious and exciting topics to share with you. As attendees of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club, you are all now members, provided you adhere to our philosophy, Ex Curiositas Scientia. We pledge to learn without prejudice in pursuit of our mutual goal, perpetual noviceship. We admit that it is impossible to know everything about anything, and thus we remain perpetually curious and perpetually novice. This is our flag and mascot, Franklin. The lightning bolt represents receipt of knowledge, the enlightenment of illumination, the resonance of truths understood. It awakens us and excites us and makes us hungry for more. And now, let us give a warm welcome to Trevin Miller of Mr. Greenbeans.
Thanks for coming. Like you said, my name is Trevin, and I'm one of the owners at Mr. Greenbeans. We have a little retail shop over on Mississippi Avenue, and we're kind of, for lack of a better term, we're kind of a do-it-yourself domestic art store. So we get into everything from soap making to cheese making, canning and preserving, and of course, my favorite, coffee. So we do coffee brewing and coffee roasting. And so for tonight's presentation, we're going to talk about how to roast your own coffee at home. It sounds daunting, and everybody see all these big fancy machines, and you hear all these fancy words, but it's actually super easy to do yourself. So we're going to kind of cover it. I'm going to go over the actual roasting process and what it takes to roast coffee, and then we're going to kind of circle back and do a couple demonstrations that'll have everything make sense. So I like questions, so if anything pops up, feel free to interrupt me at any time. Kind of makes the class or the group more interesting and kind of keeps things flowing. So ask questions. I have a bunch of roasting guides over here. So if anybody wants to take home a little do-it-yourself guide to roasting coffee, then you're welcome to take those. And then there's some business cards over here if you want that stuff. There will be a couple things that we'll pass out in the class that'll help you guys understand what we're talking about. So, is there any questions before we get rolling? None? You guys need to get another beer? All right. So, if you break roasting coffee down to its most basic form, it really comes down to 4 problems or 4 questions that you have to answer. And how you set about answering those questions is really how you roast coffee. And it doesn't matter if you're doing it in a big fancy commercial equipment or if you're doing it in a simple frying pan. You're still setting out to answer the same 4 questions. So, and by answering those questions, you can be super creative and come up with all kinds of fun ways to roast coffee. We're going to keep it pretty simple for tonight. But if you use your imagination, you can figure out how to roast coffee using a number of different methods. So, first and foremost, to roast coffee, you need some sort of a heat source. To roast coffee, you need to get the beans up to temperatures upwards of 450 degrees. So you're going to need a good solid heat source that can maintain those temperatures for 15 minutes or longer. So that can be a gas burner or a wood stove or your electric stove at home, but you need some sort of a good, strong heat source. So the first problem is heat. Second is going to be movement. To get an even and consistent roast across all the coffee beans, then you're going to need to have some way to either keep the beans themselves moving or the air around the coffee. So you're going to have some sort of a movement component. So we have heat, we have movement, and each of the different roasters kind of handles the movement in a slightly different way, and we'll talk about that. So we have heat, we have movement. The third piece is actually 2 parts. They're both natural byproducts of the roasting process, and both are going to have to be mitigated at some point. The first is going to be an example of that when we do our demonstration batches. But essentially, if you have a really good hood over your stove at home, a lot of times you can roast on your hood in your kitchen. If you have one of those fancy hoods that just blows the smoke back over your shoulder, you're probably going to want to roast outside. And if you like really dark roasted coffee, you might want to roast outside. But for the most part, it's not a huge amount of smoke, so we'll cover that. So we have heat, we have movement. We're going to mitigate the smoke and chaff. And then the final piece of the puzzle is cooling. Once you get the coffee roasted to that perfect level, you want to get it cooled down as quick as possible. Which sounds like it could be complicated, but it's really as simple as dumping the coffee into a mesh basket like this or a metal colander and just shaking it. Anything you can do to pass air over the coffee will cool it, but the idea is to cool it down as quick as possible. And that's how you go about roasting coffee. Any questions? Well, that's all I have. Yes, sir.
I actually got one. So
yep.
You can have a roaster this big, or you can have one this big, but it's the same principle.
Same exact principle, yeah.
All right.
It's pretty fascinating. So how you go about solving those 4 problems, like I said, you can be as creative as you want. There's many, many ways you can do it. The most basic form would be to do it in a simple frying pan. It's the way the Ethiopians do it. If you go to a lot of good Ethiopian restaurants and you ask them to do the coffee ceremony for you, they'll break out a little cast iron skillet and a little charcoal fire, and they'll actually roast coffee right at your table. So doing it in the frying pan, the heat source would come from like a gas stove or an electric stove. Movement's going to come from you and a wooden spoon stirring the coffee, and that's going to get to that even roast. The smoke and the chaff are going to come off at different points in the process, and we'll kind of cover that in a minute. And then cooling would come from a metal colander, so super easy. When you get into actual machines that roast coffee, then there's two basic forms, let me step back and say, there's what we call a manual way to roast coffee, and then there's what we call an automatic way to roast coffee. Not to imply that there's any such thing as a fully automatic coffee roaster, but the automatics automate some of the processes. So the full manuals would be like frying pans or something like that, whereas an automatic roaster is going to take over some of those aspects for you. And when you get into the automatics, there's 2 variations. There's what's known as a fluidized bed roaster. Both of these would be example of fluidized bed coffee roasters. And what they're going to do is they're going to use a fluid bed of hot air. That fluid bed of air is going to move up through the bean mass. It's going to be what provides the heat to the coffee. It's going to be what provides the movement. And then as it passes through the bed of beans, it's going to remove the smoke and chaff. They're pretty quick, usually fairly inexpensive and easy to get your hands on. The other variation would be a drum roaster. This guy right here is a mini version of those big fancy drum roasters you see at like Kova and places like that. Drum roasters typically have like a gas or electric burner. That's going to provide your heat. They have a drum that rotates in the middle. The rotating drum is going to be what provides the movement. And there's typically a low flow fan involved that pulls the smoke and chaff off the coffee and out of the roaster. Drum roasters, you can typically do a lot more volume, but they're typically a lot more expensive as well. So my personal favorite for roasting coffee at home is a good old hot air popcorn popper. Not super sexy by any means, especially after you use it for a little bit, but as far as an inexpensive way to go about roasting coffee, popcorn poppers do a great job. We got this guy for $2.99 at the Goodwill. We put about 200 pounds of coffee through it, so another year or 2 and we might recoup our investment. If we're lucky.
How did you clean that out, considering that there may have been butter and et cetera, in there?
I didn't.
Okay.
The good news is that when you roast coffee in a popcorn popper, you're operating well above the temperatures that it was designed for, so it's going to cook off any of that butter and oil. 1 or 2 batches and it doesn't smell like popcorn anymore.
Which might not be a bad thing.
Buttered coffee?
Buttery.
Yeah, if you're really concerned about it, you can just wipe it out with like Simple Green or whatever, but yeah, 1 or 2 batches and it'll be all clean. The unfortunate thing is that not all popcorn poppers are created equal. So especially with the brand new hot air popcorn poppers you can pick up at like Fred Meyer's or Target, most of those aren't capable of roasting coffee. They just don't get hot enough. They have technology in them that shuts them off before they get to the temperatures that we need to roast coffee. So if you can get your hands on an older one, if you can get your hands on one of these guys, West Bend Poppery 2 or its cousin, the original Poppery, they're kind of the gold standard of coffee roasters. I've seen these go. You laugh. I've seen these go for up to $60 on Craigslist and over $100 on eBay. Exactly. What?
Sorry, I have that at home, but I'll never use it for popcorn.
You're sitting on a gold mine.
No, I don't want to use it myself.
These are great, yeah. So if you get your hands on one of these, then it's almost assured that it's going to work. But even then, you never know if it's going to pop or be able to roast coffee until you put coffee in it and try. So, but older is better. The other thing, and I'll pass these around too. This one is just one that we removed the plastic coating so you can kind of see what the insides look like. But there's 2 kind of variations of popcorn poppers. There's this variation here that has metal fins around the inside of the chamber. And that's kind of what you want to look for. If you get your hands on one of those, it's going to do a much better job than this type here, which has kind of a mesh screen at the bottom of the roast chamber. So pass those around. You can take a quick look at those. But so if you find an older one and you find one that has those metal fins around the inside, then the next step is just throw coffee in it and see what happens. So. Pretty easy process when you're roasting in a popcorn popper. Then, and the stuff isn't going to make sense until we get to the demonstration, but bear with me for another second or two. So the method of roasting in a popcorn popper is essentially to plug it into the wall. Most of them don't have on-off switches, strangely enough. Plug it in the wall and it goes. Put your coffee beans in it. You might have to stir it for the first 30 seconds or so, and then you just let the coffee go until it's as dark as you want it, and you dump it into your colander to cool it. And I'll explain exactly how you know all that stuff in a second. And again, with the air roasters, then the air is going to move up through the bean bed. It's going to provide the heat to the coffee. It's going to be what moves the coffee around. And as it passes through the bed, it's going to remove the smoke and chaff. So if you're roasting somewhere, like your kitchen, where you don't really want all this chaff blowing around, then you can leave the hood on it, and it will allow you to direct where the chaff is going to go. So when we were roasting at home, we invented this patented chaff collection system here. We would just set this on our stove, turn our extractor hood on, chaff would go into the box here, and smoke would go outside. And you'd get a little bit of particulate drifting around on your stove, but it wasn't any more than dust. So super easy way to go. The whole process takes somewhere in the 5 to 8 minute range, depending on how dark you like your coffee roasted. And in popcorn poppers, they'll roast it anywhere from an 1/8 to a 1/4 pound. So not a ton of coffee, but for most people, 2 or 3 batches is more than enough to get you through a week. So if you're roasting someplace where you don't need to worry about the chaff blowing around, you can absolutely roast with the hood off and just let the chaff blow around. My little brother roasts outside on his back patio, and there's just chaff everywhere. But he likes it.
Does it affect the temperature?
What's that?
Having the hood on?
Yes. By removing the hood, you remove some of the resistance, so it can allow the popper to run a little bit cooler. So, which may or may not be a benefit, depends on your popper. So, but there you go. Super easy, and we'll do a demonstration batch in this guy here in a second to prove that you can actually do it. So he's a liar. He's making it up.
Okay, so how did you come up with 400 degrees? Obviously, these don't have thermostats on them. It's just...
It's a very good question. Nice segue, by the way. So we'll do a quick demonstration batch and answer your question. The reason why I do the demonstration batch in this guy is not because I want you to buy one of these, although I do want you to invest in one of these. I got 2 kids, college, right? So, just kidding. But I do a demonstration batch in here because it's got this really nice picture window here. So you're going to be able to see the coffee as it's roasting, and I can kind of explain what we're seeing and how you use that to roast coffee in any device. This is what's known as a Fresh Roast SR500. It's kind of one of the entry-level coffee roasters. Does about a 1/4 pound, and it's a fluidized bed coffee roaster. So super easy. I'm going to get this guy started and walk you through the actual roasting process here. It is kind of noisy, so bear with me. I'm not yelling at you. I'm just trying to talk over the machine. So, let me get some coffee here. And any questions before we jump into this stage here? Yes, sir.
Where do you find your green beans? Do you sell them?
Yes, we do.
You do?
We sell, strangely enough, we have about 40 varieties of raw coffee at our shop on Mississippi, and we get them from all over the world. So they're from Indonesia, Africa, and South and Central America. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm looking at, you were talking about doing it in scale, you're talking about doing it here with air, and are you going to lose any of the volatiles if you're pumping that much air over your beans as opposed to roasting them without a lot of air movement in a pan?
Yeah, not necessarily. I mean, you lose some, but you lose moisture for the most part. You don't lose a lot of the volatiles. They're all trapped inside the coffee bean. So,
What's a volatile?
I don't know. What's a volatile?
A volatile is a low molecular weight aromatic, so it's what you're going to find is like flavors. So you're going to lose some of the lighter weight molecules when you run a lot of air over it, so you'll lose some of the flavors.
Well done. In coffee, then most of those are trapped in the oil that's embedded inside the coffee bean. So as long as you don't roast it super dark, then the oil stays trapped inside the coffee, and most of it isn't affected by air. The air is just transferring the heat to the coffee. So
is that why the Starbucks beans look so shiny but taste so bad?
You're gonna make me trash Starbucks on live TV. In Starbucks' defense, they don't roast their coffee super dark. Starbucks' biggest mistake, and it's solely based off of distribution, is their coffee's really old. And we'll cover this after I'm done roasting. But as coffee ages, then the oils go rancid. Same thing, once they're affected by oxygen, they go rancid. Once the coffee oils go rancid, it doesn't taste good. So, and that's what anybody that's selling coffee that's more than, in my humble, non-outspoken opinion, 10 days old, then it starts to taste old, in my opinion. And Starbucks lets their coffee go for 7 months before they have to sell it. So when Stumptown first came on the market, they would not let anybody sell their coffee after 10 days. So, and that's why everybody loves Stumptown coffee, because it was fresh. So fresh roasted coffee just tastes 100 times better. So
is it the aging that happens from the moment you roast the beans until you use them, or
Yep.
is it aging happen before you roast?
There's a little bit of aging that happens. Raw coffee is shelf stable for the most part. Keep it cool and dry and out of direct sunlight, and it's going to last 6 months to a year. Once it's roasted, you're looking at 7 to 10 days. So,
Is that the same for decaffeinated green bean?
for the most part, yeah. I mean, you're getting into the weeds there, but yeah, for the most part. Decaffeinated has already been trashed. If you have to do it though, fresh roasted decaffeinated is not half bad. All right, you ready to roast some coffee? Sir.
Is there like, so you get your beans, 50, 100-pound bag or a big bag or whatever, is like there a moisture you're doing before you start, you know, the beans are wet?
No, so I mean that's a very technical question, but essentially the coffee is stabilized before it's shipped, so it goes into what they call repose. The coffee is picked, it's dried on beds at origin. They dry it until it's a specific moisture content, and then they put it into big silos and they let it sit until all the coffee beans have the same moisture content, and then it's bagged up and shipped to us. So unless the coffee's been treated really, really poorly, it's a very stable product. Just like rice, legumes, anything like that. It's, you know, unless you're putting it in a place that's got really high humidity or it's actually getting water on it, then the coffee isn't going to absorb too much from the air, as long as it's got fresh air moving over it. So,
do you have any suggestions to people, like let's say they don't live in Portland, or you know they aren't of any other sources for green? Because for me, like up until we contacted you, I know there was a few, like I hadn't really heard of it too much.
Yeah, it's kind of not the most well-known thing in the world. So, but there's a ton of websites that sell raw coffee beans, and ethnic stores. Ethiopians, they roast their own coffee. That's what they do. So good Ethiopian stores, a lot of the, I'm going to butcher it, but the halal markets, a lot of those markets sell raw coffee beans. So there's tons of places where you can actually get the raw coffee if you ask for it. Most places sell 1 or 2 varieties. If you want a lot of varieties, then guys like me, or there's a bunch of websites like Sweet Maria's and places like that that just have tons and tons of options. So we're definitely not the only people selling it, but there's lots of places to get it. So.
What prompted you to dive as deep into this subject as you've gotten?
Getting way off topic here. We've been home roasters for years, and we roasted our own coffee just because we really like the flavor. We learned about it from a class like this, just out of curiosity. We said, oh, roast your own coffee at home, that sounds interesting. We took a class, and we roasted coffee the next morning, and it tasted better than what we'd had any time before that, and we haven't gone back. And then I lost my job, and so it was like, hey, what can I do to make a living? So here I am, trying to convince other people to roast their own coffee. That's the short story. But mostly it came from us taking a class like this, which is kind of cool. Any other questions?
Roast, Daddy, yeah.
All right. We've been commanded. This young lady would like her question answered. How do you know how you're roasting coffee? So we're going to do a demonstration batch here. Like I said, I'm going to walk you through the actual process and should answer all the rest of your questions and we go home. This little machine has a built-in timer. Time is a very ineffective way to roast coffee. I wasn't ready for it to make noise. So time ends up being a very ineffective way to roast coffee. This timer that's built into this machine is simply a fail-safe. It's there to keep the roaster from burning up. So we're going to run it up to 9.9, and then we're pretty much going to ignore it from this point forward. So, welcome. Grab a seat. You're here for the exciting part. Right, so I'm going to put some coffee in here, and we'll go to town. So you can see that the coffee, at this point, doesn't look like what most of us know to be coffee. The beans are kind of small and green. They're very dense and hard at this point. You can see they're barely moving around. And if you pay attention to where they fall compared to the stainless steel line, it'll make a good description here in a minute. But essentially the roasting process is going to reduce the moisture content of the coffee, so the beans are going to lose up to 25% of their weight, and they're going to gain up to 40% in size. So throughout the roasting process, then we're going to see these beans get a lot bigger and plumper. They're also going to go through a dramatic color change. So they start out green, they're going to go into yellows, into golds, onto brown colors, and eventually black if you're really far enough. So throughout that whole color changing, gaining in weight, and losing size process, there's going to be two audible cracks that we're going to hear. They're creatively named the first crack and the second crack. There's a lot of time in it. I don't know how they came up with those, but they spent some time figuring that out. But the cracks are going to be your surest guide, and it's the most consistent way to go about roasting coffee, sort of actually knowing what the actual temperature of the coffee is. So the cracks come at a very consistent point in the bean's life based off the temperature. So once the beans hit a certain internal bean temperature, they crack for the first time. Once they hit another certain bean temperature, then they crack for the second time. So it's a very consistent way to go about roasting coffee. And it doesn't matter if you're doing it in a basic frying pan or a big fancy commercial roaster. You're going to get that same first crack and the same second crack. So it's super consistent. You can see the beans are starting to change color at this point. Essentially, hopefully anyways, we're going to go, turn the noise down a little bit. We're going to go from this green color into yellows onto gold. And right about the point where we go from a golden color to a light brown is going to be when we get the first crack. And the first crack is going to be a lot like popcorn popping. It's going to be a good, strong snap, snap, snap. Each of the beans is going to crack one time during the first crack. So much like popcorn, you're going to get a pop here, a pop there. It'll pick up pace a little bit, and then it's going to taper off. So each one of the beans is going to crack one time. What's happening during the first crack is as the beans are drying out, it's building up pressure on the seam down the middle of the coffee bean. So if you look at green coffee beans compared to roasted coffee, then the beans are very tight. And as they plump up and dry out, then they build up pressure on that seam and it actually pops open. If you have these sitting on like a tray or something when they crack, you can see them pop like popcorn and then close right back up. It's kind of cool. But each of the beans will do that one time. We got a little ways to go here, but you can see that they've gone from the green color through the yellows and they're working their way into the gold. The way flavor of coffee is going to work is the closer we are to the first crack, well first off, from the first crack forward is the palatable stage for coffee. So once you get into the first crack, from that point forward you can shut it down at any point and it's going to taste like coffee. Whether or not you like it is a matter of personal preference, but it's coffee at that point. The way the flavor works is the closer you are to the first crack, then the more of the origin character of the coffee you're going to taste. So the type of tree that it was, the type of soil that the tree was grown in, how the fruit was processed, all those flavors are going to come out the closer you are to that first crack. So if you like a really light roast with very vibrant fruit flavors, you're going to want to be on the lighter side closer to the first crack. As the coffee gets darker and gets closer to the second crack, then we start to add what we call roast character. Roast character is going to be the caramelized sugars, kind of the deeper, darker, heavier flavors. So if you like your coffee to taste like brownies, you'd want to be a little closer to the second crack. We should be getting close to the first crack at this point. A little bit longer.
But the volume increased by 25% or something.
Yeah, you'll gain about 40% total as the coffee gets roasted. So it'll nearly double in size. Depending on how dark you roast it, anywhere from 16 to 25%. The light roast obviously would be in the 16%, a very dark roast would be in the 25%.
And this already didn't cover second crack.
Excuse me?
Have we talked about the second crack?
Not yet. Kind of hoping for the first crack.
What kind of roast like process is it?
It's kind of fascinating. I don't know if you can smell it, but you're going to start to be able to smell the actual roasting process. It's not really producing any smoke at this point, mostly steam. But as we get closer to the first crack, then we'll start to get into a little bit of the smoke. At this point, it just smells like cookies.
If we were doing this in a cast iron skillet with a lid, would we be shaking it like we would when we do popcorn?
If you have the endurance to shake a cast iron skillet,
Or would you be stirring it?
I last that's about 2 minutes on that. But yeah, you would either stir anything to create movement. So like I said, if you can do it, shaking's a great way to do it. But a lot of people use a wooden spoon and stir.
Okay, I think off the popcorn popper.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Is that what I would be using for this all the relation?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way to do it. I don't know if you guys can hear it, but that's the first crack going. Stop. Can you guys all hear that? So that's the first crack. So the first crack, they're both cracking sounds, but the first crack is definitely different than the second crack. Again, it sounds more like popcorn popping. It's a stronger snap, snap, pop, pop. And after you hear it a couple times, then it's super easy to tell the two apart. But I don't know if you noticed, but the first crack kind of started like a pop, 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 and then there was a pause in the action, and then there was more popping. That wasn't the first crack and the second crack. That was just the first crack kind of rolling forward. So you wouldn't want to get confused there and hear like, oh, I heard a crack, that's the first crack, and then, oh, I heard another crack, that's the second crack. It's getting dark. Or in fact, you're just in the middle of the first crack. So after a time or two, then you can easily tell the difference between the two. But when you first start roasting, then it helps to pay attention to the actual color of the coffee as well. At this point, you can tell the beans are a very light brown. As we get closer to the second crack, they're going to turn into more like a dark chocolate. And your question was how quick the process went affected the crack? Yes and no. You really get into the science of the roasting process there. You can change the flavor a little bit by how quickly or how slowly you roast it at different points in the process. But it's really getting into the science of it. It's a long conversation. What's that? No, it's not. So the first crack is pretty much done at this point. You can see the beans are still growing inside. It's almost filling up the tube there. And we're going to start working our way towards the second crack. So the second crack is going to start much like the first crack did, with a tick here and tick there, but it's going to sound more like Rice Krispies and milk, or if you've ever heard pine needles running, it's going to sound more like that, more of a tick, tick, tick. So it'll start like the first crack did with a tick here, a tick there. It's going to build up in speed, but unlike the first crack, it doesn't stop. Once it starts, it keeps going. So you're starting to get a couple ticks of the first crack at this point. It always starts with a tick here, a tick there, another tick, tick. So you can use the second crack, like the first time you hear a tick of the second crack, you can shut it down there and it'd be just before the second crack. If you let it go, it's kind of ticking sporadically now, but those ticks are going to come until they're coming steady. You can shut it down at that point and it'd be just into the second crack. So right now they're coming steady. I'm going to stop when I say that. Can you guys all hear that? You tell how different than the first crack was? So it's going to keep going until that crack is just coming rapid, and from this point forward, the longer you go, the more smoke you're going to get. If you go to a really dark roast, you're going to have smoke coming out your ears. I'm going to go ahead and shut it down here, mostly because I'm tired of yelling. So what I did is I just kicked it into a cool mode, and it should cool the coffee down fairly quickly, and then we'll turn it off. Much like cooking any food, if you were to just take the coffee out of the roaster and dump it into a colander and let it sit, the beans on the inside would continue to cook. So you'd end up with a much darker roast than you intended. So, much like a steak, yes. You want to pull it out and get it cooled down as quick as possible, so that you end up with the same roast level as you want. And I'm not going to do that because I really get tired of the noise. Turn this off, take this out of here. And, oops, I'll put this in there. It's still kind of hot. Normally I'd let this run through the whole cooling cycle, but like I said, I get kind of tired of yelling. So I'll pass this around. You guys can smell this. Don't touch the beans, they're still kind of warm. And then I'll pass that around and you can take a sniff of that one as well.
So once they cool, is there like a curing, like paint, or like a setting, like a cake?
Absolutely.
Would...
It's like I planted you there to just ask the Absolutely. As I'm demonstrating with the aroma here, then once you... I don't get paid, so. Once you pull the beans out of the roasted, then they don't necessarily smell like you would expect them to smell. They just smell kind of hot, like burnt toast. It doesn't have that fresh roasted aroma that you're probably hoping for. That coffee was roasted about 2 hours ago.
Different, really
Yeah.
different.
Slap the lid back on when you pass it around.
So what's the optimal amount of time from the moment it comes out of the roaster to when you should brew the coffee?
Subjective. Typically 12 to 24 hours is a good starting point. Some coffees do better, closer to like 72, 48, someplace like that. But 12 to 24 is a good starting point. So it really depends on the coffee and what you're using as a brewing method.
So wait, it is.
Yeah. So back to answering your question. So immediately after you get it out of the roaster, then like I said, they just smell kind of hot. So at this point, they're off-gassing CO2. So you'd want to get them out of the roaster, get them cooled down as quick as possible, and then just let them sit in the open air and get as much of that CO2 off them as possible. Best 1 to 4 hours of just letting them sit in the open air, unless you have some sort of a container that can act as a one-way valve. Mason jars, it's passing around, work great. Put the lid on a little loose and it acts like a nice one-way valve. It'll let the CO2 out, but it won't let oxygen back in. So 1 to 4 hours after it's roasted, you want to let them sit and get as much CO2 out of them as possible. And then after that, you're going to want to put them in an airtight container and let it sit for 12 to 24 hours. So 12 to 24 hours after it's been roasted, then it's going to hit its peak of freshness, and it will maintain that freshness for 7 to 14 days, depending on how you store it. There's some coffee roasters in Portland that are throwing darts at me right now. But it's all right.
So in this cooling, just leave it in the sieve or put it out in a cookie sheet?
Anything you can do to dissipate the heat. Yep, anything you can do to dissipate the heat. Spreading it on a cookie sheet obviously dissipates the heat really quick. If you have a good fan, like a downdraft, you can stick it over your downdraft and just pull a massive amount of air over the coffee. That'll cool them down really quick. You can take a box fan, put it over a box fan. Anything you can do to pass air over the coffee and cool it down. Once it's to the point where you can hold it in your hand and it's not really giving off a lot of heat, then you can just let it sit and it'll be fine. So, the idea is just to get it below its roasting level as quick as possible. So, yeah, airtight container. Once it's roasted, airtight container and in a cool, dry location. So you wouldn't want to stick it in a window that's getting like the noonday sun. And you wouldn't want to stick it in like a cabinet that's got a heater blowing against it or something like that. So cool
all
and dry.
the stuff about storing in the freezer, that's too hot?
I don't know that it's too hot, but you don't really gain anything. So it's kind of like it's a net zero, so why do it? If you have, like, say you roasted up some really amazing Colombian geisha and then you got called out of town on business, absolutely triple bag it and throw it in the freezer. But for day-to-day use, you would lose more by constantly taking it in and out of the freezer than you would gain by storing it in the freezer. So just cool and dry and in an airtight container. And like I said, mason jars work great. Put the ring on a little loose and it'll allow the beans to burp out any CO2, but it won't allow oxygen back in. So, yes ma'am?
So that machine obviously drew the chaff out of the beans and we weren't able to see it. At what point do we expect that to come off? So if I'm roasting in a pan, when will I see it?
Good question. So that's the chaff that it generated. So like she said, this has a fancy little chaff collector, so you don't really see it coming off. And I neglected to point it out while it was actually roasting. But typically when the beans start to turn gold, you'll start to see the chaff start to flake off. So from the gold level until just after the first crack is when the majority of the chaff is released. You get a blast when the beans pop open during the first crack, and from that point forward, there's not a lot left.
So if I had that in a frying pan, it wouldn't matter if I left that in until the beans were finished roasting?
Nope. In the frying pan method, or like a popcorn popper method like you were talking about, a manual popcorn popper, then the chaff just stays in during the roasting process. So you'd roast your coffee, you might get a little bit of it floating around as you're stirring the coffee, but when you went to cool the coffee would be when you would mitigate that chaff. So you dump it into a colander that would allow the chaff to fall through. So big hole.
Is the chaff bitter? I mean, if you aren't able to separate it,
it would be really hard to get enough chaff into the into your roasted coffee to affect the flavor. So the biggest thing it's going to do, it's going to make a mess out of your grinder. Coffee beans themselves are prone to static, as some of you probably know really well, and the chaff is 100% more prone to static than the coffee, so it just sticks to your coffee grinder. But it's not going to affect the flavor of your coffee. But for the frying pan method or any method where the chaff is going to stay in during the roasting process, then a colander with good sized holes like this is what you want to use. So dump them into it, shake it, all the chaff is going to fall through like that. So, did that answer your question? Any questions about the roasting process? Did the cracks make sense to everybody? First crack, second crack. Did I do a decent job of describing how the flavors are affected by the roasting process? Does that make sense?
So would you generally want to stop at the second crack, or would you ever want to go beyond that?
That's up to you. And I think people are going to throw darts at me again, but I don't believe that there's a right or wrong way to roast coffee. It's really personal preference. As long as you know what you're doing and you know that you like that, then great. So if you know that you like a really dark roast, then absolutely go into the second crack a little ways. When you're new to roasting, one thing I would say is don't expect your coffee to look the way it did when you were buying it at the store immediately out of the roaster. So if you look at this coffee now, it's pretty flat. There's not a lot of oil on this. 24 hours from now, this is going to be a very oily coffee. So when you're roasting it, you don't want to roast it to the same color and oiliness that you were used to buying it at the grocery store, because that's going to come with a couple days of rest.
So this is just trial and error about your own flavor. So stop at the second crack and then experiment as time goes on to find that.
Yeah, most people
shade.
have a general idea of what they like, whether it's I really like a light roast or I like a dark roast. So that's your first. Like, start with what you know you like. If you know you like a dark roast, then you're going to want to go at least a little ways into the second crack. If you know you like a really, really dark roast, then you're going to want to go a lot farther into the second crack. If you know that you like a light roast, don't go into the second crack. And then kind of go from there.
Years ago, I'd done reading on this, and essentially I read that you don't want to do this indoors because the smoke is so awful, and you'll never get your kitchen back. But
No.
I didn't see it. Is that only if you go to espresso?
Only if you go really, really dark. Ooh, you're opening another can of worms there. Yeah, as long as you don't roast it really dark, there isn't a ton of smoke. We'll do it in the popcorn popper, and there'll be more smoke out of the popcorn popper. This blows a lot of air through the coffee, so it dissipates the smoke. You can probably smell it and feel it on your eyes. It's in the air in here for sure, but it's not enough to like cause any problems. So we roasted for years in our kitchen, and the next day you couldn't tell that we roasted coffee. So as long as you don't go super dark, if you're roasting in a frying pan or something like that, where the beans and the chaff and everything are in contact with the heat the whole time, you're going to have a lot more smoke, and it's not going to be as aromatically pleasing as, say, in an air roaster. So there are variations of that, but for the most part, if you have a decent hood over your stove or a decent way to evacuate the smoke, then yeah, you can roast inside. If you don't have a decent way to evacuate the smoke, don't roast inside. My joke about opening a can of worms. Espresso is merely a way to brew coffee, and it's not a way to roast coffee. So you can take a very light roasted coffee and you can pull shots through an espresso machine. It's just going to change the way. So when you say, an espresso roast, that doesn't, like just roasting dark doesn't make it work for espresso. And I would highly recommend trying coffee a little bit lighter roasted through an espresso machine. It can come out pretty amazing. So just my own outspoken opinion.
What's your preferred method of coffee preparation past the roasting, the grinding, and the extraction, all that?
Again, there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's all personal preference, and I highly recommend just trying multiple ways. My preferred method is pour over through a paper filter. I just like a clean, sweet cup of coffee. But everybody has their own taste buds, and everybody knows what they like. So best you can do is just go to different coffee shops for people that brew different ways and try different things. You'll zero in on what you like. So the roasting process made sense? All right. I was going to say something and I completely forgot what it was. So, again about the oils. So, don't roast the coffee until it looks like the way you're used to buying it. And the reason why is as coffee ages, it's going to continue to change. So, if you're used to seeing really oily coffee, oil is a function of two things. It's a function of how dark the coffee was roasted initially, and it's a function of how old the coffee is when you go to use it. So. Even a light roasted coffee, if you let it sit long enough, is going to have oil in it. So, and those oils are what go rancid. So the more oil you have on your coffee, you're probably going to want to use it a lot sooner because it's going to go rancid a lot quicker. So, and then the last piece of advice is don't grind your coffee until immediately before you're going to brew it. Again, all the flavor and aromatics are trapped inside the coffee bean, as long as the oil is trapped inside the coffee bean. So once you grind it, you release all those oils to be affected by oxygen. So cardboardy flavor. So I wouldn't store them. If you're going to try to store something for multiple years, either deep freeze them triple bagged or can them is your best bet. So I don't know. The best way. Yeah.
Just an aside, is there any other use for any other part of the coffee, like the chaff, or like when it's in berry form, or is there? I mean, I don't know anything about coffee aside from drinking it, but
chaff is good for your compost.
I hear you can feed it to cats, and then when they poop it out, you can do that.
No, that's the coffee cherries.
Oh, the coffee cherries.
Yeah, Kopi Luwak. Yeah, that's horrible.
Yeah,
It's
it's
gone all day without even hearing about it.
It's super expensive and it's interesting, but it's horrible.
Have you had it before?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If it was natural, I wouldn't have a problem with it, but the majority of it is done by taking cats and putting them in cages and force feeding them coffee beans.
Oh, gross.
So it's nasty. Leave it alone. But so going back, then coffee is the seed of a cherry-like fruit, and typically the coffee farmers just compost that fruit back onto their trees. So they'll take the coffee, they'll pick it, they'll process it, and whatever comes off the processing, the water and the pulp and everything gets composted back onto their farms. So most of it is reused right there. Once you get it at home, there's not a lot that comes off of it other than the chaff and then the grounds after you're done brewing. And both those are great for your compost. You can grow mushrooms in the coffee grounds, which is another use. But there's not a lot. Soap, you can make soap out of coffee grounds. Really good for the skin. But the chaff,
they're exfoliating.
and then the caffeine is really good for your skin too. So, yeah, kind of fascinating. But not a whole lot. And then there's not a lot of byproduct. I mean, this is the amount of chaff that came off of, a little roast. So if you do the composting thing at home, then there's nothing to it. I mean, you could pinch this down and make it the size of a coffee bean. There's hardly anything there. Yeah, not a lot of waste. Any other questions?
I got one more question.
Absolutely, fire away. You have good questions.
So, probably at least a few other people here have worked at a coffee shop at some point in their lives, and I remember that there was like a Robusta and a Arabica bean, and there was like different things that had to do with each one. Does that affect in any way this roasting process? Is there a different taste? Is there any of that?
It doesn't affect the roasting process until, like I said, I mean, on a large level, yeah, you treat all different beans different ways, but on a micro level or macro level, no, it doesn't affect it. But flavor-wise, if it tastes good, it's Arabica. So there's two types of coffee trees. There's Arabica and Robusta. And like I said, if it tastes good, it's Arabica. If it doesn't taste good, it's Robusta. Think Folgers, Maxwell House coffees like that. Most of those use some sort of level of Robusta blended into them. It has its benefit, double the caffeine of Arabica, usually a heavier body, and in an espresso it usually pulls a better crema. So a lot of times, like in a traditional Italian espresso blend, they put Robusta in there, and that's what makes it, kind of gives it that bite. And it blended properly, Robusta isn't bad. It adds kind of a nice nuttiness if it's blended properly. But by itself, it doesn't taste good. But double the caffeine, so what do you do?
So you mentioned you have many different types of the beans available in your store. What would be the price ranges, and what do you get when you go to a really premium bean versus
flavor is really, I mean, that's flavor and character are what you're getting from the more expensive coffees. Typically coffees range, right now they're ranging from $4.50 a pound on the green side unroasted, $4.50 a pound to, well, the sky's the limit, but average $4.50 to $8 a pound. Once you get above $8 a pound, then you're really paying for prized coffees that have really delicate nuances, really great flavors, something special about them.
Something you're not going to want to learn to roast on.
No, and unless you have really good control over the roast process, then I don't tend to recommend the expensive coffees. A good quality El Salvador is going to taste just as good as a good quality Hawaiian, but cost a third the price. So for most people, so if you have a really good palate or have been playing around with coffee for a while, then it's absolutely worth investing in some of the higher priced coffees because they definitely have something special to them. But starting out especially, and even yourselves as you go forward, if you don't have a really good palate or you just don't care, why spend the money? That's not worth it. So, any other questions?
Yeah, actually, you mentioned mechanical popcorn makers, so.
Yep, hand crank, absolutely.
Well, yeah, so the thing you find is second action. The other thing that I've seen, I've read about were the air poppers.
Great segue. I planted him too. So who wants to be the guinea pig and show the rest of the group how to roast in a popcorn popper? You got to take the coffee home with you. Victim, yes. And you guys can all come up, and there's not a huge group, so you guys can all come up and check this out. So let me get this out of the way and grab my popcorn popper. So, let's see how much you were paying attention. Remember how to do this?
Yeah.
Put the coffee in and watch it.
Exactly. I remember the plug-in part.
So I've custom melted my butter dish to hold the perfect amount of coffee. So go ahead and fill that guy up with a little bit of coffee there. Yes, sir.
I noticed the air circulation. You talk about the distance between the bottom here.
Yeah, I think you missed that part. We covered that at the very beginning, so I'll go back over it for you.
I wondered if it made any difference.
It does.
This is the one.
Yeah, the ones with the fins around are better. So we're going to put the coffee in there. We'll go ahead and plug it in and get it started.
So put it in here first?
No, go ahead and plug it in and get it started. Once it's running, you can go ahead and put your coffee in there. So if you look real quick, when you first put the coffee in, it doesn't move around all that much in the popcorn popper. So at this point, you're going to want to give it a little bit of a helping hand. And you're not going to hurt the coffee, so you don't have to worry about being gentle. You just kind of crank it out. The idea here is that you're moving the beans around so that you get an even and consistent roast. If you were to leave the coffee sitting there, then the beans on the outside would scorch, and the beans on the inside would remain unroasted, so you get kind of an uneven roast out of it. You usually only have to stir it for about 30 seconds or so, and then you'll see the beans start to move around nicely on their own, as you can see they're doing now. Yeah, just as they start to dry out, so if you look kind of sideways to the light, you'll see the steam coming off the coffee at this point, and the chaff. So once they're moving around nicely on their own, if you're roasting someplace where you don't want to blow chaff everywhere, you can throw the lid on it. And again, if you look sideways to the light here, you'll see the smoke and steam coming off of it.
Oh, so this like really goes down.
I haven't cleaned it in a while, so it's a little extra smoky. At this point, it's mostly steam coming off of it, though. You feel it. But one of my favorite parts, especially about roasting in a popcorn popper, is the aromas that come off the coffee when it's roasting. At this point, it smells like a warm wheat field. I remember bucking hay as a kid, and it just reminds me of bucking hay. I get itchy thinking about it. But yeah, so it starts off smelling like a warm wheat field, and it goes into cookies baking, onto nuts roasting, into chocolate forming, and eventually oil burning if you go far enough. So it keeps going through these really amazing aroma steps. And if you have a really good nose, then you can train yourself to roast solely off the smell. Like you can pick out, okay, at this point it smells like fresh mown grass, this is happening. At this point it smells like this is happening. I just get nostalgic. That's all it happens to me. Yeah, absolutely. So there's the coffee's already gone through the green stages that into the yellows and moving into the golds at this point. Still got quite a bit of chaff coming off of here. So this is your coffee to take home. So how do you like dark roast, light roast?
I'm gonna go light on the lighter side.
Absolutely.
I'm worried about these flavonoids or whatever escaping.
The volatiles.
Yeah, the volatiles. I don't
Yeah, so some of them, then yeah, you have to build a chimney on it so to keep the beans in the light zone. No, it just depends on which one you have. And each popper is different. Like you have to kind of modify your roasting technique based off the poppers you have. It takes a little bit of kind of a DIY spirit. So we've moved through the golden stage and we're working our way on the light browns at this point. We're probably a minute away from we're a minute away from the first crack at this point, except for that guy. We always get a couple early bloomers. No, it'll get there. In the beginning, they kind of come at different levels, but as we get towards the darker roasts, they get very
louder. Popcorn maker too.
You don't have the big plastic lid over the top, so you get the cracks are much more significant here. So that's the first crack starting there. I was way off on my timing. You see the beans are all getting into that nice light brown color. You can see the uniformity picking up. So if you said a light roast?
Yes.
Alright. You're colander. So like I said, once you get towards the end of the first crack, you're going to get a little blast of chaff at this point. But as we get towards the end of the first crack, then the majority of the chaff is gone. So if you're roasting someplace where you're okay with a little bit of chaff flying around, you can pull the lid off at this point.
Okay.
It'll extend that first crack time a little bit, and it'll save your lid from melting all the way. What hours?
Yeah.
We're 10 to 6 during the week and 11 to 6 on the weekend. Other way around. 11 to 6 during the week and 10 to 6 on the weekends. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
See, it's all a nice light brown at this point. We got a few more snaps of the first crack finishing up. We'll let it go a little bit longer. Let's just shut it down. This particular coffee comes out pretty well on a light roast.
Okay.
So we haven't started the second track yet.
No, he wants a light roast, so we're not even going to go into the second crack.
Oh, okay.
We're not doing it. A little bit longer. So when you get to, in the popcorn popper at least, when you get towards the where you want to be done, you just unplug it from the wall or whatever you're plugged into and dump it into a colander, and then you just want to shake the colander to pass air over the coffee.
Do you have a recommended coffee grinder?
Yes.
Electric versus
A burr grinder.
period dot.
Yeah, hand or electric, but if it's good, shut it down. Okay, just cracked it. Dump it into your colander. And there's a little bit of smoke coming off it at this point, but look at that. Bigger colander, harder to spill. There you go.
It does. It smells like burnt toast.
Yeah, you want. Yeah, at this point, it just smells like burnt toast. But this is the same coffee that we had in the jar that we passed around earlier. After.
So just kind of for the record, it's kind of the best way to do it is to kind of roast as much as you're going to use in a week.
Yeah, we tend to recommend that you figure out what you're going to consume in a 5 to 7 day period and roast that much. Some people like to roast a little more often, so then you figure out what you're going to consume in 3 or 4 days and you roast that much. For me, this would last about a day at the most.
Well, so you have to budget your time because you got 24 hours before you can use the fresh beans.
Yeah, it takes a little bit of planning. I mean, if you wanted to, then you could absolutely throw this in a grinder right now, and I've done it on more than one occasion, woken up in the morning and like, oh no! Roast a quick batch, cool it off, throw it in the grinder, grind it up, brew it. It makes an okay cup of coffee, but the way humans taste is we base our taste off of smell. So if things don't smell good, they don't taste good. So at this point, it just doesn't have a lot of smell to it, so therefore it's not going to have a lot of flavor. And then much like soup or lasagna, it'll taste good, but if you let it sit for 12 or 24 hours, it tastes 100 times better.
If you're in that crunch time, the 911, do you tend to roast it darker than you normally would to have that immediate
No, not necessarily.
more aroma?
Yeah, because you don't necessarily gain aroma by roasting it darker. And in fact, a lot of the kind of more charred components take even a little bit longer to develop. So if you like a dark roast, then 36 to 72 hours might be a little better than 24 hours.
Oh, that's good information.
Yeah, that thing gets super hot. Watch your hands. You can dump them in here if you like. There you go. Coffee roasted in a good old popcorn popper.
Awesome.
Told you I was lying.
So when is it functionally cool?
Right about now. I mean, they're still hot,
You know,
but
when you can touch it, or when?
yeah, when you can hold it in your hand and it doesn't hurt.
Okay.
At that point, it's well below the roasting, and then you just want to spread it out to dissipate the rest of the heat. If you're doing multiple batches, then like spread it on a cookie sheet or a colander like this where it can kind of spread out, and let it finish cooling. Roast another batch.
Is there a spot in town to get, like, because I had a roommate that had like a hand crank grinder. It was really cool. That makes a good, is that a good grinder?
If it's a good quality burr grinder, then absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, hand cranks can be a very inexpensive way to get into a good quality burr
It
grinder.
was super wicked too, because then people would come over and you'd be like, oh, let me just make some coffee. I'm really impressed.
Well, I had heard from some people that the electric grinders, if you're not careful, you can burn your coffee.
Yeah, it's more of a problem with blade grinders, and you're really splitting hairs at that point, in my opinion. The biggest problem with like the whirly blade grinders is that you get a very inconsistent particle size. And the whole idea about brewing coffee is extracting flavor from the coffee bean. You're starting with a bean like this, and you want to extract the flavor. How hot you run your water, how long you let the coffee bean soak in the water, and what type of particle size you start with is all going to go into what your coffee tastes like. So brewing coffee at home really comes down to what particle size you start with. And with a blade grinder, then you get talcum powder and whole beans in the same basket. So it's really hard to extract the flavor because you have a very inconsistent particle size. With a good quality burr grinder, then all the particles are going to be a fairly consistent size, and then you can go about extracting the flavor.
If the oil in this, sorry if I'm taking the floor, but if the oil in this is what goes rancid, is there a method then, or does it matter about cleaning the burr grinder?
Yeah, you want to keep it clean, especially
do you
if
run
you
rice through it to get the oils out of it? Or,
I don't know that I'd run rice through it. Rice ends up being very hard, and you can run the risk of destroying your grinder. But there's cleaning things you can run through it. A lot of times it's just a matter of getting a brush in there and brushing it out. If you like really dark roasted coffee, it's super critical. If you like lighter roasted coffee, it's not as important, but it's always a good idea to keep it clean. Sometimes you can just dump a small handful of fresh coffee through there, grind it through, dump it out. Put a handful in, grind it through.
Just replace the oils with fresh oils.
Exactly. Yeah. Any other questions on the roast process? Or?
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah, I have a question on the grinding. So
absolutely.
I'm using a spice grinder, and in about 18 seconds.
The blade?
Yeah, it's very, very uniform. It's powder. So what's wrong with powder?
If you're brewing espresso, then there's nothing wrong with powder.
Okay.
If you're brewing any other method like pour over, then it's going to plug up the paper filter and it's going to cause the water to stay in contact with the coffee grounds too long. If you're doing it in a French press, then it's going to stay in contact with the water too long and it's going to give you a very muddy cup of coffee. So as long as you match your particle size with the proper brewing method, then there's nothing wrong with it. But you definitely want to pick, if you have coarse ground coffee, you want to do it in French press. If you have fine ground coffee, you want to do it in some quick extraction method. That makes sense?
Well, yeah, it makes sense. So what is the optimum contact with water?
It varies depending on the brewing method. Espresso is what, like 30 seconds, 24 seconds? I've never worked in a coffee shop.
I can't remember.
What's that? I think it's like in the 20 to 30 second.
I don't know when I
in a French press, it's like 4 minutes. It
It
really comes down to your particle size. The pour over, it's 2.5 to 3.5.
That's right.
So it really comes down to your particle size.
I don't know. I'm sure this is some kind of faux pas, but like, does anybody ever add like something to it? Like, since it's in a popcorn grind, cooker, do they add
coconut oil? I wouldn't. Butter's gonna burn because you're operating, like you said, 420. Where we took this was about 420 degrees.
Yeah.
So butter's gonna burn at that point. Coconut oil might be interesting.
I don't know. I mean, that's not standard practice. So.
No.
Okay.
The coffee has its own oil in it, so there's really no reason to add anything extra to it. But you could play around. You might find the next best thing.
Oh, maybe.
In a frying pan, you wouldn't want to add any.
No. A clean frying pan, any uncoated pan. So you wouldn't want to use a pan that has any sort of nonstick coating because you're going to cook those coatings off, destroy your pan, and end up with Teflon on your coffee. So, carbon steel, stainless steel, cast iron, any non-coated pan in a frying pan.
Well, not knowing what my popcorn popper would be over a wood burning stove or whatever, but you can achieve this result at a lower temperature, but it would just take longer. You have to reach this temperature. Just for clarity here.
Can you do it in an oven?
Yes. If you have an oven that can maintain 450 to 500 degrees. If you have like a pan like this where it's got holes in it, then the air is going to naturally move back and forth. But if you have a solid pan, then you'd want to shake it a little bit. Convection ovens actually work really great. You can put a whole pound of coffee on a cookie sheet, put it in there, and go to town. But the key thing with coffee is temperature and how quickly you get to those temperatures or how slowly you get to those temperatures. But coffee's never going to taste the same if you don't get to that 420, 410, 400. It's not going to crack. It's not the same thing. It may get dark. Like you could go 300 degrees and end up with coffee that's this dark, but the beans are going to look shriveled and weird, and they're not going to taste good. And it's not going to taste good at all. So. Taking off.
Okay.
That was awesome. That was really
Okay, thanks again, Trevin Miller. We return again on April 2nd with Carl Anderson and his talk, Aqua Choppers of Chunk 666. Chunk 666 is a mutant bicycle club and civic society which has been building, riding, destroying, and rebuilding human-powered choppers, tall bikes, and battle wagons for 20 years. We previously held free yearly public gladiatorial contests and historical reenactments, but more recently prefer to enjoy ourselves privately. One way to do this is with a regular amphibious camping trip to Ross Island, a hollowed-out toxic waste dump and quarry in the middle of Portland. This talk will briefly discuss our history, our philosophy of building machines out of trash, and our interactions with the city around us before describing how we create, operate, and destroy amphibious human-powered vehicles. Carl Anderson is a hardware and software experimenter who is good at thinking up projects, but bad at predicting whether or not they will be practical. He's recently been involved in a traveling post-apocalyptic training installation and a free telephone company. Thank you very much.
If you grab the book, then any questions you have or comments or whatever, feel free to contact me by email or come and visit our shop whenever you're in the area.
That's awesome.
Glad you enjoyed it.